Okay, we're going to examine for a moment the concept of ethnography. Before we talk about ethnography specifically, let's remind ourselves sort of where it fits into the total package of research opportunities available across the academic spectrum. And clearly there is a different set of research tools that hard sciences use. You know, they primarily use hypothesis and testing. They use lab experiments, scientific method to come to the conclusions that they come to in the hard sciences. Studying the social world, on the other hand, is a different matter. We can't necessarily subject people to the same type of tests that they do in hard sciences. Now, this isn't to say that there's not some interplay, there certainly is. But on the social side of matters, of trying to understand people, culture, norms, beliefs, society, we have a different set of tools. One of the tools that you'll know about, and is probably the most popular, of course, is surveys. And here we use an instrument, or we use a questionnaire set to ask a lot of people about their opinions or their beliefs or their views on something. And that's wonderful for the concept of generalizability. So if I were to just hold up a scale like this, okay, giving out surveys to 300 people or 1,000 people is really good. It's really high in generalizability. So if you take appropriate sample of the population of Britain, for example, and you want to know their attitudes on anything or who they're going to vote for, using proper survey methods, you can get a very accurate estimate of what the British population thinks about a political candidate. It's very high in generalizability, but that doesn't work so well for complicated social issues. You start asking questions about things that are more complicated, these questionnaires tend to break down. And they tend to break down because we don't know what people are thinking when they take out these questionnaires. We don't know how they interpret these questions. I think one of the classic mistakes that social scientists make, and particularly sociologists in this capacity, is in both the United States and in England for the last almost 30 years, maybe more than 30 years, they've asked this question, is homosexuality always wrong, sometimes wrong, occasionally wrong, rarely wrong, and never wrong? So there's so many problems with that question, right? First of all, they're only doing half the scale, right? What about sometimes right, occasionally right, mostly right, and always right? But the next thing is that they don't define wrong by which means, wrong for who, what are you talking about? Are you saying for the individual if they're gay? So we don't know how people interpret that question when they're filling it out. So surveys like that are very high in generalizability, but they are very low in telling us the truthfulness, the validity, or a different type of validity than a statistical validity. But do we know what they mean by those answers, right? And so up here, right, there you go again, very high in generalizability, but very low in sort of trustworthiness, very low in sort of like, are you really measuring what you think you're measuring? How do we really know that? Then as we go down this scale, we get into around this area where we hear a lot about, surveys, or not surveys, about interviews. And here people talk about, I sat them down and I gave them an interview. And then there's different forms of interviews and different lengths and all of that. And the idea here is that you are going to get a number of people and you're going to ask them more questions than the kind of questions you can ask them on a survey. And so you're going to get down here more trustworthiness, more validity, more, you're going to get closer to the truth, but the generalizability goes way down because you can only do so many interviews. Interviews take a lot of time. Enter ethnography. Ethnography is at the very bottom of the scale. Now, ethnography has a lot of strengths compared to interviews. Oftentimes in interviews, people that you're with, that you bring in to interview, they just tell you what they think you want to hear. They want, their primary purpose in going into an interview with you is either that they're going to be compensated, right, or not. But especially if they're compensated, I think. But they want to prove to you that they're smart. So they're often looking to tell you what they think it is you want to hear. They don't go into the interview thinking, I want to help science. I want to be honest with science and tell people what I think and believe. That's not what happens. There's a lot of complicated interactions that occur in an interview, particularly when it's face to face across. It's like they're being examined, right? It can also be an intimidating environment. And so ethnography is designed to take some of that complication away. Ethnography can be done generally on fewer people than interviews, but it gives you really high trustworthiness, really, really high understanding of how people think and behave in that culture. So I just want to give you an example. So I did some research on a football team once. This is a soccer team in America. And I've done a lot of research. I've done a lot of ethnography, and I've done a lot of surveys. I've done a lot of instruments as well on athletes. And my subject relationship is mostly about heterosexual men and their relationship to masculinity, and often how that ties in with homophobia, their beliefs on gay people, and particularly gay athletes. And so I remember this, two decades ago, but I remember interviewing a footballer before I started ethnography on the team. And so I flew out to another state in America, and I sat these guys down. The first couple of days, I did these interviews, right? These in-depth interviews. They didn't know me at all, and I just did these interviews. And I got this. I just remember this one guy saying, "Oh yeah, that he was really homophobic," and it's just sort of, I was like, okay, right, so I'm writing it all down about this guy's beliefs about same-sex sexual interaction and all of that. And then I ended the interview portion of the research, and then I entered the ethnography portion of the research. Now, to enter an ethnographic study, you have to develop relationships with the people. You have to spend time with the people. You have to get to know the people. You have to get to know them as friends. You have to get to know them as, you have to become part of their community. And this takes a little bit of time, obviously, and it can be done in a shorter period of time. But if you're around them with more intensity, but you really have to get to know them. And so I start going to classes with, and training with this college soccer team. So I'm with them, I'm traveling to games, I'm going to all of the practices. I don't really play soccer well, but I'm pretending to. They're laughing at my lack of abilities, but I could outrun them. And I'm going to parties with them, I'm getting drunk with them. And now I see the same individual who has sat down under interview and told me about his antipathy to same-sex sexual behaviors. And I see him doing shots off of another guy's stomach, right? You pour I don't know if you guys do this in this country, pour the shot into somebody's navel and then licking it out. And I'm like, what? And then I started hearing about these threesomes he's having with two guys and a girl. And, and then, as it turns out, that the interview was completely and total posturing. And that actually, this guy was incredibly gay friendly, was cuddling with his mates and all sorts of stuff. And that's the kind of data you can get at when you become accepted into part of that community. Now, clearly, there are limitations as who can be accepted into that community. Today, I'm 52, not 32. I was a young-looking 32 back then as well. The football team may not want an old guy hanging around them, going to parties with them. May not want, an old guy, so vested in their lives. So I may have lost that ability. I'm sure I've lost that ability to do that type of ethnography. There will be locations where men just don't do a good job of ethnography, and there's be locations where women don't, and there's all sorts of variables at play. So you have to choose the right ethnographer for the right situation. But if you do that, you can get somebody into the culture, and you can really see how they operate. And it provides a much better basis than not only the interviews, but it gives you a much closer truth than just observations alone. And there's this famous ethnographer, and the field of ethnography really came from what we call cultural anthropology. Not anthropology in terms of digging bones out of the dirt, but cultural anthropology, understanding other societies, not our own society. Cultural anthropologists are interested in studying other people's societies. And around 1915 or so, there was this famous anthropologist, one of the most famous ever, named Malinowski. And he went to this tribe. I forgot where it was, Southeast Asia or somewhere. And he saw them performing this ritual. And, you know, at surface level, you would think, wow, this has serious significance of something. And he was, you know, what it relates to and so forth. And then he started asking the people, why do you do this? Like, you know, why are you so excited about this ritual that comes up once a year? No, I don't know. We just do it. Well, what does it mean to you? I don't know. We just do it. It's just fun. They had no investment in the original application of whatever that ritual was. That original idea is gone. So it looks like it has some deep structural meaning, but it doesn't. It's very much so like our Christmas, right? Our Christmas, of course, it's a complicated history of where Christmas came from, right? It originally came from pagan celebration, right? Mythos, to celebrate, you know, the turning of the year, heading back towards spring. And that's where all the bunny rabbits come from. And I'm sorry, no, that's where the white Christmas trees come from and stuff like that. Christianity took a lot of those symbols and they adopted it into a Christian perspective. And we have Christmas, which is supposedly to celebrate the birth of Jesus. But who in England celebrates Christmas today because it's the birth of Jesus? We celebrate Christmas because we just do. We just like it. We just enjoy it, right? It's family time. And if you ask people, if I asked you, why do we put up a tree? What meaning does that have? You know, why do we put a star on the top of the tree or this? Why do we wrap our presents? And why do we do presents either the night before or the morning of? And we don't know. We just do it, right? And so what Malinowski was able to show is that if you really want to understand the way people think and interact with their culture, you have to become part of their culture. Now, there is a danger to becoming too involved with the culture, because if you become too involved with the culture, you might end up what we call going native. Now, I'm not sure if that term is politically correct or not anymore, but it is the only term that I know to describe it. So we'll go with it for a moment. And I want to give you an example of a time that I went native. I was teaching at a university in Southern California in the late 90s, and they invited me to be a faculty advisor to a fraternity. And this was a fantastic opportunity. What happened was I was lecturing about fraternities, and I said they're rape factories and they're highly homophobic and they're full of hyper macho men and blah, blah, blah. And there were hundreds of students in the class, and these fraternity members objected. And they said, that's not the way it is. And I responded, well, that's what the research says. And he said, well, then come research us. So I went, okay. So I started researching this fraternity, but the only way I could do that was to become a faculty advisor. So for 2 years, I was a faculty advisor to this fraternity. And I really got into their world. I really got in to see things through their eyes and from their perspective, and to believe their beliefs. And for the most part, they were wonderful men. There's no doubt. But I showed up one day and I was talking to a fellow researcher about this fraternity, and I had their T-shirt on. Didn't even kind of realize I had their T-shirt. I'd been branded by their research, and this other researcher was just laughing, and I was like, "Oh, and they're this and they're that." And she was laughing at me, and I was like, "What's she laughing at?" I'm sharing with her my notes from my ethnographic field notes from this months that I'd spent with this fraternity. And she just kind of laughed harder and harder. And then I said, what are you laughing at? And she goes, look at your shirt. And I looked down on my shirt, and it was this, it had like bombs and tanks and boobs and beer on it, and all of these images of hypermasculinity. And I just kind of went, oh shit, I've gone native. I started seeing things through their eyes, and I lost some of that criticality. So in short, the value of ethnography is it really gives you the opportunity to know how a local culture thinks. I use it on sports teams. It really gives you the opportunity to understand that sports team. It's not very high in generalizability. Just because it happens on that one sports team doesn't mean that what you find will apply to another sports team. but it's really good for understanding that one sports team. So if you combine it, like I have with this book here, for example, this is a collection of many ethnographies that I've done on many sports teams, both in Britain and in the United Kingdom. And the photo symbolizes he's a American and he's a Brit. He came over with me to do some research, and they became two straight guys, you know, became best friends. And like so many straight guys in my research, they end up cuddling. And so I said, hey, can we put that on the photo? And so I kind of shot it with a track there. But the idea here is that I could really get into their worlds, and I do that enough locations, then I can start to generalize, and I can say, you know, there seems to be a consistent finding here. And of course, for me, it was that young straight men are more inclusive and nicer and, you know, gay friendly than they've ever been. And you can then take a number of studies to start to generalize. So ethnography, high in truthfulness, high in a certain type of validity. But you have to be careful not to lose your criticality, not to sympathize with the people that you become friends with, that you immerse yourself with too much. Because if you do that, then you could go native, you lose your criticality, and you stop seeing things for what they really are. So that is the concept of ethnography.